From the United Nations in New York, I'm Melissa Fleming, the United Nations Undersecretary General for Global Communications. We are here today to talk about the first ever UN General Assembly Sustainability Week, which will take place from April 15th to the 19th. This is a flagship event convened by the President of the 78th session of the United Nations General Assembly, His Excellency Mr. Dennis Francis. He is joining me here today in the UN studio. Mr. Francis, a warm welcome.
Thank you, Melissa.
We are gathered to discuss Sustainability Week, but also about a new campaign under the hashtag Choose Sustainability. The campaign calls on member states, civil society organizations, United Nations entities, and the public to choose sustainability through pledges and challenges that can make a difference. The topic of the campaign could not be more relevant today. We have already passed the midway point for the implementation of the 2030 Agenda, and our sustainable development efforts are facing strong headwinds. Yet, delivering the SDGs continues to be the most effective way to build peace and prosperity for future generations. So let's dive deep into this very urgent issue with our very special guest, the President of the 78th General Assembly. Nice to see you here with us. And let's get started and talk about first the ambitious agenda of the UN Sustainability Week. From what I am reading, it will include 5 sector-specific conversations in the space of 5 days. So is there a common thread among these events, and what is the key message that you would like to deliver?
Well, Melissa, thank you for the opportunity to discuss these issues with you. In fact, you mentioned the common thread, and the common thread is, indeed, sustainability. Sustainability is important because it has everything to do with the success of our existence on this planet. But in terms of the 5 sectors that you mentioned, these are key sectors of most economies that if these sectors, if we get them right, we will in fact be achieving the goal of stimulating sustainable development. And sustainability has to do with the gap between the wealth, those who are wealthy, and those who are perhaps disadvantaged. That gap has been increasing. Sustainable development, therefore, if achieved, when achieved, will help to close that gap, bring more people into the system, and ensure, as we say in the negotiations, that no one is left behind. So this is sustainability for all people everywhere on this planet. That is the agenda of the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, to lift people up, to give them hope, to empower them to achieve their individual goals through sustainability. So, for example, we are discussing on the first day of the week, the 15th of April, sustainable debt. Many countries in the global south have got an overhang of large debts that must be repaid. But in repaying that debt, not much is left by way of resources to finance things like education, health, national security. And so those countries find themselves trapped in a cycle of debt from which they cannot emerge because they have got to repay the loans that they took. And this creates a development crisis. That is one of the reasons why in the global south there continues to exist today approximately 860 million people who are hungry. That is why approximately the same number of persons in the global south are living in abject poverty. We need to lift these people up, to give them hope and promise for a better standard of living and welfare, so that they can look after their children and they can feel empowered to dream and to achieve, to work towards achieving whatever they want to achieve.
And so the really key aspect of this would be to lift and remove that debt, or to make the debt more affordable.
To make it more affordable is the critical component. To review the terms and conditions under which those loans are secured. The interest rates tend to be punitively high, and that, of course, creates a burden on these very vulnerable countries that we refer to as countries in special situations, the least developed countries, the landlocked developing countries, and the small island developing states. And so they are trapped because they have got to repay the debt. There's no question of not repaying the debt. No one will lend you money, no bank will lend you money unless you have a record of maintaining your scheduled payments of debt. So they've got to repay the debt, but in doing so, there isn't enough money left over to finance things like education and public health. And of course, that in itself creates additional poverty.
Right, and also leading to the second area of focus during Sustainability Week, which is infrastructure.
Infrastructure.
Again, that is really critical to build for sustainable societies, also
Yes.
transition
Yes.
to energy, or even energy at all. Talk a little bit about what you expect from that area of focus.
Infrastructure is crucial to development. We tend to take it for granted, but consider, for example, the impact of the accident in Baltimore, the bridge in Baltimore recently. Consider the impact of that, not just on Baltimore or on the state of Maryland, but on the entire economy of the United States. Because that port, the port of Baltimore, processes a lot of exports and imports into and out of the United States. And so the potential ripple effect will be across the American economy. That is why infrastructure, one bridge, can make an enormous difference. Now, this is a huge, powerful economy. So the effect might not be very dramatic. But if it were a small country, dependent on a single port for all of its trade, you immediately see how cataclysmic that event would be. Because it means then that that country will not be in a position to maintain its links with the global value chains. And so infrastructure is extremely important for sustainable development. It's a game changer. The building of infrastructure, let's think of it in terms of the discussion that took place maybe 4 or 5 years ago about renewing America's infrastructure. That the experts say have been constructed a long time ago and is now old and is in need of renewal. Infrastructure connects people. And it's important to connect people because that's how economies operate. Markets don't exist on their own. They're only markets if people can get to them and exchange product or service for value, for money. And so building sustainable infrastructure that has the capacity to withstand external shocks, such as hurricanes, such as, I forget what they're, cyclones, and, you have them.
Tornadoes.
Tornadoes, that's the one. Tornadoes. Infrastructure that can withstand the stressors of extreme climate events mean that the economy bounces back much more quickly in the future when such events take place, number one. And number two, the cost of reconstruction is significantly lower and perhaps even marginal because those structures can withstand the forces, extreme forces. And so that's why sustainable infrastructure is important. We had this morning on the news the earthquake in Taiwan. And you saw an image of a building literally almost standing on its side. That's the sort of event where sustainable infrastructure becomes important.
So infrastructure that can withstand also the extreme climate shocks of our time.
Absolutely.
But also perhaps, and we can't speak about climate shocks without speaking about transition to energy that is sustainable as well. Is there something you'd like to add about especially developing countries as they move to develop their economies and our push as the UN and as the President of the General Assembly to have that energy source be sustainable energy, renewable energy?
Yes. And in fact, energy is one of the 5 sectors that will be featured during Sustainability Week. As you know, we have an SDG, SDG 7, that deals specifically with the need for people to have access to clean, affordable energy. And so that transition is extremely important for climate change reasons. We know that decarbonization is absolutely necessary. You notice I'm wearing a pin here that says 1.5 degrees. This is the threshold that developing countries, that the entire international community endorsed at the climate conference in 2015, and that developing countries have held fast to, because if the global temperatures were to rise above this 1.5 threshold by 2050, the consequences for those countries in vulnerable situations, the SIDS, the LDCs, the LLDCs, would be totally catastrophic. And in fact, we have started to see some of that evidence already in places like the Pacific, where sea level rise threatens to inundate some of the low-lying atolls in the Pacific. And therefore, this 1.5 degree threshold is important. And the sustainability that would come with the transition to green energy is really the prescription for minimizing the damage and dislocation and costs, both human and capital costs, that will inevitably arise if we do not take urgent climate action.
I understand also linked, and during this Sustainability Week, there is going to be a big focus on another aspect of infrastructure, and that is sustainable transport.
Yes.
What are you going to talk about in this realm? Is it electric vehicles? Or?
It's everything, actually, because transport spans the gamut of the combustion engine. It spans the gamut of rail transport, maritime transport, air transport. We're looking at the transport sector holistically because it is so critical for development, regardless of what end of the spectrum a country is at. Transport is absolutely critical to development. Transport integrates markets. It moves people around the world. Tourism is a sector we are looking at. I believe I read a statistic that annually the tourism market is valued at something like $3.3 billion. So this is huge. $3.3 billion, yes. This is huge. And so transitioning to green energy and electric cars becomes important in that configuration. But it's more about transportation sectors being available and media being available to people at affordable rates, which is why the green energy is important. Because in the conversion to green energy that is required, you will not have the downside of contamination of the atmosphere at the levels that now exist. The green energy will get rid of the carbon that pollutes and contaminates the atmosphere and creates the extraordinary climatic events. So the sustainability involved, therefore, redounds to the benefit of the society as a whole, because with less carbon in the atmosphere, less extraordinary climate events, ability to connect people and markets more efficiently at lower cost, and therefore to drive down the cost of economic activity, which is good for the economy and it's good for the people. So all of these sectors you mentioned actually are linked through the sustainability considerations, because let's not forget, in fact, this is an extremely important point. When we're talking sustainable development, we're not just talking about sustainable development in our lifetime. We're talking about sustainable development that will fuel and support civilization 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 generations ahead of us. And therefore, it becomes important, long-term sustainability for life on this planet, as we understand it, becomes the goal.
And your Sustainability Week is happening in the months leading up to the Summit of the Future, which will be happening here. So we're thinking a lot about the future that you just described, and yet policies seem to be so short-sighted. I mean, I wonder, you come from Trinidad and Tobago.
Yes.
Perhaps an island nation, at the front lines of a lot of these issues. But can you imagine a future for Trinidad and Tobago that could be painted if all of these infrastructure factors were put in place? What would it look like?
It would be heaven, quite literally. You know, every time I'm there and I drive my car around the city, if you know the city of Port of Spain, you will know that it's rimmed by mountains. Port of Spain is a port city, of course. And there's nothing more stunningly beautiful any morning but to either walk around the city or drive around the city and watch the sunlight coming over the mountains. It would be the perfect place. Now, there are other issues that we have as a country that would need to be dealt with. But if all of those elements were in place, it would really be a good place to raise families and to raise children, to give them the hope and the sense of security that as human beings we deserve and can live dignified lives in harmony with the environment and with our natural ecosystems, and yet be successful professionally and in business. So the message is really, the key message is that there is no conflict between achieving economic success and achieving sustainability. There's absolutely no conflict. It's been done in some places. It requires commitment and it requires vision. And I think we have both. We have both. So I would expect, therefore, that all countries would make a deep dive and recommit to sustainability. That's why we decided to launch the sustainability campaign, the Choose Sustainability. Because if each of us made some basic changes to the way we do things, for example, many of us, without thinking about it, brush our teeth in the morning with the tap running. How about turning the tap off while you brush your teeth? You may save 3 or 4 gallons of water that the people in the Southwest United States and in parts of California wish they had in their taps. Water is a scarce resource. So we need to rethink how we use resources. Because if they're not, these resources are finite. There is no bottomless pit. And so in many parts of the world now, there's a deficit of rainfall. Drought is a reality. Places that were literally food baskets, it's now drought due to climate change. That's why we have to live more responsibly. We have to rethink how we use resources. We have to optimize the use of those resources in order to ensure that there will be a supply for our great, 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 and even greater grandchildren.
Well, that is a very inspiring way to describe the Choose Sustainability campaign,
Yes.
which I think we'll all get behind. It's very much linked to the UN's global campaign, Act Now, and that is, calling on all of us to do our parts as individuals, but also as policymakers and as leaders to choose that future, which is a future of sustainability for all of us. So, thank you.
Sustainability and success.
Sustainability
And success.
And success, and to show that it is a successful path.
Yes.
It is a path that is in our self-interest, but also
Absolutely.
it's economically viable.
That's the message.
That's the message. Well, thank you for joining me today to show the importance of this week. It's really exciting. And looking forward to seeing what this week's activities will bring, how many people are going to get inspired.
Yes.
And hopefully it will help us together pave the way for a more sustainable future. Thank you to the President of the General Assembly, Dennis Francis, for joining us here today.
Thank you ever so much for having me.